Welcome to the Prime Venture Partners podcast. This is your host, Amit Somani, and I am delighted to have a entrepreneur and a friend and a neighbor, Gaurav Singh Kushwaha, co-founder and CEO of Bluestone. Welcome to the show, Gaurav.
Thank you, Amit. Excited to be here on Prime Venture podcast.
Thanks, Gaurav. I've known you from actually the late 2009, 2010 timeframe when you were perhaps at that time a first-time founder. Although knowing you, you might have done two companies before that, which was a company called Chuck Puck, in the movies and movie review space. So maybe you could tell our listeners a little bit about the first startup, if that was the first, before we go on to the journey of Bluestone.
Great. So indeed, that was the first startup. Amit, before that, we had there were a few ideas which I dabbled with, but a proper run was the first run was Chuck Puck. I started it in 2006 along with my co-founder Nitin Rajput, and we were in the kind of a mix of social network and entertainment space. At that time, Web 2.0 was just coming up, and a lot of properties in India, a lot of portals in India were kind of very primitive. Those were like Yahoo type portals and not exactly Facebook, MySpace kind of portals. And world over things were moving to Web 2.0, which was when we thought that okay, Indians are so passionate about movies, their entertainment, and so on, and there's so much excitement to kind of talk about it, review stuff, engage, debate with each other, and so on. And so it would be a very interesting offering for them if we can create a Web 2.0 kind of a service on top of movies and entertainment. And indeed, what we saw was that the product offtake was very, very nice. I mean, there were very few internet connections at that time. I remember broadband connections at that time were less than 1 million, I think 5 lakhs, 6 lakhs, and so on. And there were projections that those would increase to some 10 million, 100 million, etc. by 2010-11. That truly happened only after the advent of smartphones. So while the product offtake was good, what we realized was that it was very difficult to monetize many of those. Rather, it was difficult to monetize a content-based social network at that point in time. There was not a lot of money on internet. Even e-commerce per se had not evolved. So we ran it for around 3 years, and very quickly we were kind of among the top 50 websites in the country. Monetization, though, was a struggle, which kind of kept us haunting for almost 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, I remember vividly both using Chuck Puck as a user and at least thinking about how will they ever monetize kind of thing. So as you decided to wrap that venture up or move on from it and think about Bluestone, what were some of the lessons you carried away from the previous venture? Let's start with that, and then we'll talk about why you picked jewelry as a category and Bluestone as the company in that category.
Sure. So I think one of the very first lessons was to kind of do a deeper study of the market where we intend to enter. So Chuck Puck in a way was started as a project out of boredom. So we were Nitin and we both were working in Amazon, had plenty of time at hand. So in the evenings we would just do some coding and so on. And it was just a fun project to begin with. And that's how it started. But then we invested our 3 years into that. So next time when I was starting, I was actually very particular about things like TAM, how big the market is. Is it how easy or difficult is it to kind of make inroads into that market? Most importantly, how defensible that category is, right? So I think one of the most important things that I look at in any category is that fine. I mean, there are lots of categories where you can easily enter, but if life is not becoming harder for the next person entering into the same category, then you're not actually truly building a differentiation. It might become big, but when 4 more people enter, it will just become 1/5 of whatever you were. So that must not happen. So many of these things we had learned in our first venture. And when I was starting Bluestone, I looked at many of these aspects in the category and hence chose Bluestone. I can elaborate that on those also if you want to.
Yeah, that'll be great. But one just follow-up question on the previous 3 things you said, right? So one is TAM. Second, very interesting one actually, which got my attention is the defensibility. And as investors or professional investors, we always look for differentiation at entry and defensibility or moat, 5 years hence, right? Because you could enter because there's nobody else, but if there's no defensibility, that causes a problem. The third, which you didn't mention, I don't think, but did you figure out, or was that implicit in the TAM, customers' willingness to pay? Right? So will people pay for this? Right? Of course, jewelry people will pay for, right? So I get that. But like Chakpak, everybody was probably using, like you said, you're a top 50 website and so on. Is there like willingness to pay? Could there be viable economics? Or you're just saying, look, jewelry is a big category. Everybody wants jewelry. Can we innovate? Can we differentiate? Can we build a defensible offering here?
Got it. So on that front, Amit, I'd actually think of Chakpak and Bluestone in slightly different ways. So in Chakpak, we were trying to do something new in an existing category. Okay, something totally new. So our offering itself per se was new, right? That you can actually come on a portal and do some of these interactions. Bluestone per se was a very, it's a direct commerce model. So people pay for jewelry? They do. Are they paying offline for jewelry? Jewelry at that time was also a $60 billion market, which now is around 80 to 100 billion US dollar market. So the market is huge. Okay, now will people pay for it or will people buy it online was the only big question. So will people pay for jewelry? Yes. So that is anyway captured in time. Is online going to make a substantial dent into the market? I think that was a very big question at that time also. But that was, and in any startup, there are a few unknowns. Right? If everything is known, probably Tata and Reliance of the world would do it anyways. So there are some unknowns, and because of my last 4-5 years in consumer internet and the confidence that I had on my understanding of consumer internet, I said, okay, if rest of the questions are answered, or if rest of the things are answered, then this one particular question is something that we look forward to kind of experiment and get answers for. Even the biggest players, even like Tanishq, etc., in the space were hardly doing anything online at that time. I think CaratLane was around, but they were primarily selling solitaires, not jewelry. Right, so we were the first ones to actually start into the jewelry segment. After which a lot of people followed, and we did a lot of innovations to kind of make the needle move there. But it was not very evident that people will buy it online. Right. At the same time, the offering was exactly what was there in offline also. Right, we were just selling it online. Whereas in case of Chakpak, the offering itself was different. So will people pay for that offering? In Chakpak was not very clear. Here, will people pay for the offering? Was clear. Will they pay it online or will they buy it online? Was not very clear.
No, that's fair. In fact, I remember in the US, I used to stay there for a while. There was a company called Blue Nile, right? Which was also in the jewelry space, and from the 2000.com era days, right? And I even remember having bought something back in early 2000s from Blue Nile for my wife there. So I knew, but what gave you the confidence that this online will happen, or was that a long bet? Think it will take 10 years, but it will happen, right? Like there's no doubt it will happen. Just take time.
Totally. Somani, so it was a long bet. My hypothesis there was that, okay, in fact, I remember back in 2007, 2008, when people were debating or arguing that why would anyone buy books on, right? Before Flipkart came to be. And what I had seen again, time and again in any category is that categories kept on moving on. Right? So people, they got their comfort first from books with low value, kind of very specific, very particular, very tangible product. They started buying that online. Then they moved to other categories, which are so on a two-dimensional coordinates. Essentially, if you look at in 4 quadrants, if you look at price and let's say the tangibility of a product. So books are low price products and very tangible product. You know exactly what you're getting. Those are the easiest to move. Then let's say something like clothes, shoes, etc., which are still low value, but it's not a it's not a box or a very tangible product. You don't know exactly what you're getting. Just look at the picture and take a call. Then third category like smartphone is high value but highly tangible. You know exactly what you're going to get in the box. And then jewelry, cars, etc., fall in the other bucket, which are very high value also and which are very intangible also, in the sense it's not very specific. It's not specification driven products. So ours was going to be the last category to move online. I was very clear about it. Okay, but whenever it does move online, the point was that the category was huge. The category is bigger than even electronics in this country, right? It's almost 9 to 10% of the overall retail. So the game was going to be big, was very clear. That the defensibility was going to be there was very clear. It's not easy to enter into jewelry. Even if you look in the offline world, it's not that there are like 20 people who entered into jewelry successfully over the last 20, 30 years. It was just one company, that too backed by Tata, right? So you need a lot of grit, a lot of backing to actually make inroads into this category. You need to kind of earn the right to be a jeweler. So a lot of those things favored it. I think the only biggest question that we had had in our minds at that time was, would people buy it online or not, essentially. Yeah.
Got it. And how has online penetration changed? I know that I see Bluestone stores everywhere now that I go, especially in Bangalore and in some other cities. And we'll come about that as well later in sort of coming full circle. But how did the online penetration pan out? Like, what did it keep rising? Where are we at now?
Right. So yeah, so I think that's a very important question, and that's a question which is, or that's a particular facet which is very less understood. So essentially, what happens is, okay, what does one mean by online penetration? Okay, uh, when we started the business, we also thought very kind of online and offline. That this is an online company, this is an offline company, it's an online business, an offline business, and so on. What we realized over 4 to 5 years, that the consumers are not just online or offline. It's not the whole world population is split between these are the guys who are always online and these are the guys who are always offline. Not like that. So what we realized was that how we defined online at that time when we started was how many people are buying it online. Over time, we realized that buying is not the only thing that internet can do. It can go beyond that also. It can do much more powerful things than just acting as a sales channel. Okay, so and I'm assuming that your question, when you say how many, what's the penetration of online, you mean online people buying it online, which is still very, very, very low. So in our category, I believe it is less than 1% of the overall people who are buying jewelry in the country are buying it online. Okay, however, that does not mean that online is not important, and we'll touch upon those also as we move along later.
Yeah. So might as well elaborate on that, Gaurav, which is that what happens in the online assist. So I'm assuming people discover you online or build conviction or do, shopping and selection or narrowing it down, and then look for offline, physical presence to kind of consummate the transaction. Is that how it works?
That is right. That is right. In fact, that is true for us, and that is true for a lot of high value categories. It becomes very difficult for people. Okay, so in our category, what happens is, if you look at the offline world, okay, if you look at the offline world and how people buy jewelry, you would realize that it has not changed in the last 30, 40, 50 years. Now, if you go back to any other categories, let's just think of how we used to buy shoes, let's say 50 years back, or shirt 50 years back. So my dad would typically go to a shop to buy shoes or to buy a shirt. Okay, and it would always be a counter based experience. So a person would be on the other side of the counter. My dad would tell him that I'm looking to buy a check shirt. He would actually get a shirt out. Then he would say, okay, more dull colors or bigger checks, etc., etc. And there'll be an iterative session. And then at the end of the session, he would actually converge on on the product, and he would actually walk away with that product. I had never heard my dad saying, on the weekend, let's go check out this store or this shop. If we would ever go to a shop, it would be to buy a shirt or to buy a shoe, not to check them out. Now, all that changed with large format retail. I'm talking offline only, right? So with Shopper Stop Lifestyle in US and other markets, other retailers, what they did was they replaced the counters with aisles. And that shopkeeper or that shop person who used to be on the other side of the counter actually came behind you. Right? So there was no counter, there were people to assist you. And the whole experience moved from buying experience to browsing experience, or from buy first to browse first. It worked across all the categories, right? Even mundane categories like groceries. If you go to if 20 years back, you would actually go to a grocery store and keep telling that person that I want this, and so on. And there'll be kind of 5 more people talking to the same person when you were also talking. Even the smallest of the grocery stores now have converted to aisles from the counters. This happened across the categories. IKEA did that in furniture also, and they reaped the benefits of it. In jewelry, that didn't happen. Now, going back to the other categories, now then what happened was that the buying, that buying behavior moved to browsing behavior, and then came online, which actually then made those aisles endless and made that behavior or took that behavior from weekend behavior to a week-long behavior. Now you can actually browse for products on Myntra, on many other websites, even when you're having a lunch or when you're commuting to office before sleeping and so on. So that browsing, which was a weekend habit, became a week-long habit. And and people started browsing more and more and more, and buying became a side kind of a side product of browsing. None of that happened in jewelry. Right? But people's behavior was changing, but the category was not actually catering to that. So when we gave them option to actually meaningfully browse jewelry online, that was the first time they ever got that. Otherwise, jewelry is way more expensive than shoes, apparel, or anything. But a woman was still, or a consumer was still taking that decision within 1 hour. And under a very high pressure uh, environment, wherein, let's say, okay, in case of shoes, let's say for my wife, if she is buying a pair of shoes, she would actually have spent several days on Myntra. She would have made several visits to malls and so on, and then she would pick up one pair of shoes. In case of jewelry, she would actually go into a store and say, "Kya hai tumhare paas?" And he would say, "Kya ye hai?" And she would have no idea what to even expect. That there are these 10 or 15 or 20 subcategories in rings also. And so today's consumer knows about, let's say, 20 subcategorization of footwear, but she wouldn't know about 20 subcategorization of rings just because you cannot browse it. Now, if you go on our website, we have those 25 categorization. And this is the first time that's even happening. Otherwise, one would only enter a jewelry store to buy a ring or an earring, and then they would walk away with, they would walk out buying one of the things that is available, that was available that particular day. They would not know what all the were their options. So online made all that possible. However, owing to the high ticket size or high value of the product, it needed the support of offline to kind of convert that, or to make that whole browsing meaningful for the consumer, and for the business to convert all that browsing into transactions.
No, that's very interesting. This whole browse first behavior versus, transactional buying behavior and so forth. The question is, when did you in your journey realize, and by the way, we're seeing this with a lot of other brands also, right? Like a Warby Parker versus the Lens Card or so many other brands, right?
Yeah.
That offline is going to be offline is going to be very critical to the number one. Number two, today, now that you have 100 or I think 150 stores
150.
or whatever, 150, right? You just touched 150 stores. Do you also find that there's a lot of customers who have not browsed online and are just throwing up straight offline in a meaningful way? I'm sure there are some, but like, is it double-digit percentage points, or is it largely still online assisted and online led before they actually show up in the store?
It's mostly to so I think more than 80%, not think actually, I have data, it's data backed observation. More than 80% of the people who are walking to the store have actually browsed the website in past 3 weeks.
Amazing.
Before buying. And this is essentially what is largely leading to the success of our stores also, because see, jewelry store is not something which is easy to run or easy to make profitable. And that's why you don't see a lot of new jewelry stores popping up near your neighborhood, right? Let's say wherever you are living, a new grocery store opens, you'll start buying your grocery from there. No two ways about it, right? Just convenience. A new electronic store opens, you will start buying your USB drive, hard disk, phone, etc. from that store. A new jewelry store opens, you wouldn't even notice that there's a jewelry store that is open. You'd still go back to your jeweler that you have been buying for the last 15, 20 years whenever it came to jewelry shopping. It's just not very easy to make jewelry store profitable within first couple of years. Forget about first couple of months. In our case, most of our stores are profitable within 1 to 2 months of rolling out. And not because offline, and this is because online is supporting them in a big way. So while they are, it's like a football game, right? I mean, the goal is scored by a forward. But that doesn't mean that you take all the defense on all the support system out of the ground and they would still do well. They would not. Right. So stores in this case are the forwards for us.
100%. And in fact, I used to work in advertising at Google many years ago. And I think one of the biggest myths, even when we see young early stage entrepreneurs, is first click versus last click attribution. So you always, even an online only full experience, right? Like your Myntra shopping experience or XYZ. You're just thinking, okay, last click, that's what it is. But you don't know where they discovered you, where they engaged with you, where they built the conviction. And they come into the store, 5 minutes, they buy it, and you say, look, I'm an amazing salesperson. It's like, no, a lot of work was already done before they walked in, right?
And this last click, first click is also a crazy thing. It's just very difficult to kind of build. In our business, we see, even when we are only offline, now it's even more complex with with kind of a lot of these transactions happening online, how do you attribute? But even when you're only online, given that our purchase cycles are 3 to 4 weeks, where do you put your incremental money? And you'll always feel inclined that you are getting ROS of 20-25 here. Maybe you should put more money there, but it won't increase any sale. It will just dilute the ROS. Right? So it's just
Right.
it becomes very, very difficult unless you build the right attribution models. And I'm saying you had seen that in Google where it was purely online only world. Everything was still measurable, or everything was measurable, and people are still not taking the right calls. Now imagine this, which is a lot more complicated: channel switching, people switching, your cookies identified switching. You're not able to actually stitch together all the data properly also. And then trying to figure out where to spend your money, where to spend your resources, and so on. So I think a lot of people struggle there.
So I have two very interesting threads to pursue with you. One is, let's say there's some entrepreneur listening to this podcast who's running in an interesting new category. It could be even a D2C brand. It could be something that, that they're enabling. At what point would you recommend they foray into offline? Because like you said, it's not easy, it's expensive, unit economics at an offline store level might be difficult, etc. Right? I mean, I know it's a little vague question, but at what point should you meaningfully start thinking about offline, or should you be thinking that from day zero? Saying, look, in an India kind of market, you're going to need offline, otherwise it's not going to work.
I'm not sure if that's even true for all the categories, right? In our category, what had happened was the high ticket size, and there's a category where people generally have the fear of buying from a new person, right? So there were fundamental reasons why offline was needed, or a store was needed to support the same transaction which was originating online. In many of the cases, so let's say if the ticket size is low, if you're creating a, let's say, online only publishing house, you don't need offline. And there's also a very extreme example, I know, but you don't
Yeah.
need offline person. It depends on in that spectrum where you're falling. There are categories where people would happily browse online and convert online also. So
Yes.
there you would largely be online. Okay, and even then you can build offline touch points like Make My Trip did, I think, right? Or even Shadi.com, etc. Some of these legacy online players had also done. And I think they got more comfort, more leads. As in customers got more comfort, they got more leads, more business, etc. from that. But that was kind of incremental business for them, right? And they got kind of new transactions from them. In our case, what was happening was the same person, same transaction is actually flowing through both online and offline. Now, in our category is very, very particular. And okay, so, and what is true for us is also true for a lot of high value categories. For example, cars, if you see, you don't see a lot of omni-channel player, but that doesn't mean the behavior is not omni-channel. Behavior is omni-channel. The same person who browses cars on cardekho.com for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, deciding which car to buy, reviews, photos, discussions, whatnot, then goes into the dealership to do a test drive. So the behavior is omni-channel. Just so happens that the offline part of it is so well taken care of already that one does not need to build that. Now in D2C, mostly it changes because you're selling your own products. Right? And wherever there is omni-channel behavior, you yourself need to kind of make sure that the offline part, leg of it is also covered. For example, for a lot of apparel brands, the consumer behavior is still omni-channel. People go to Shopper Stop and check out those products, then go to Myntra and buy it. Now, consumer is behaving omni-channel. As a company, you are not, because someone else is taking care of the offline part. In D2C, mostly there is no one else who is taking care of this offline part. For example, in our case, these are our own products that we are selling online, or making people or letting people browse them online, right? So we have to take care of the offline part ourselves. And that would be true for a lot of D2C players. But I think in our case, for example, let's say stores can amplify. And we did a lot of surveys before entering into this, right? Our hypothesis was that stores can potentially increase the size of the business on an as-is basis by 25 to 30 times. Now, that would not be true for many of the other businesses, right?
Yeah.
For many of the other businesses, it might be incremental 20%, 25%, 30%, and so on. In our case, again, this is strictly because of the nature of the category. So that is on whether one should even go offline, and on exactly when to go offline. I wouldn't suggest thinking about offline from the day one, because it will just actually put too many things on your plate. Online is beautiful when it comes to iterating on the product, getting the right product market fit, right? Many of the cases, 2 years down the line, your product has changed significantly from the first version that you had in mind, right? So all those iterations are better done in online world, where the cost is low, where you can actually listen to your customers, where you can talk to each and every, where where you talk one-on-one with each of your customers. You kind of collect, you have very strong handle of data and so on. So while all this iteration, etc., is being done, and the first round of scale up should only happen online, offline should not even cross your mind. But I'm saying once that is
Got it.
done, then you speak more to your more. Then you speak more with your consumers, figure out what kind of a role, how can you even expand your offerings, and what kind of a role can offline potentially play there. In our case, we spoke to our people who were actually, okay, so what gave us the strongest insight was when we spoke to people who were buying from us and asked them RTBs, why were you buying from Bluestone? The strongest RTB, almost 86% people said designs. Now that's not true for a lot of e-commerce, right? E-commerce is price and convenience mostly. Ours was design choices, price and convenience together was only 4%. So it told us that we are a product brand. We are truly a product brand. And that's how we had always started and what we always believed. Now, for every one such person, there were at least 25 to 30 who were exhibiting the same browsing behavior, but were not converting. When we spoke to them, the number one reason was, how can I buy something so expensive without touching and feeling it? And they all said, even this 25 to 30 times, this cohort of which was 25 to 30 times of the buyer, they all said the same thing, that designs were beautiful, we can browse so many products and so on. But when it came to buying, almost all of them said, how can we buy without touching, without, so number one reason was touch and feel. How can I buy something so expensive without touching and feel? Number two reason was, where would I go if something goes wrong? If I need to change my ring size, if a diamond falls off, where do I go? Number three was, let's say if I need to exchange it 3-4 years down the line, if I want to exchange this design for a new one, which is a very common behavior in India and so it's a behavior very, very peculiar to the country. Where would I go? And then we realized that, okay, we can solve for all these with just with a simple store. So that actually, those were the insights that came to us. And when we were talking to these customers, the very first time, our objective was to figure out how to improve our conversion funnel or how to improve our checkout funnel. That was the reason why we were talking to them. And then we realized that our checkout funnel needs one more page, and that page is offline.
Yeah, that's very deep and profound. In fact, I was going to ask you that, how did you have the insight to do the, reason to buy survey, and whether you would recommend that for others. And you kind of answered it at the end that you didn't start with the reason to buy. You started with how do I improve the funnel? But maybe you can talk a little bit about some best practices around RTB as well as objections to buy. Like, are there any good tools or tips or blogs or books that guided your thinking, or this was more first principles?
This was almost all first principles, Amit. I was just already in this space for almost 8 to 10 years. I don't know. I mean, whatever books I might have read in 2006, 7, and so on, all the blogs and so on. After that, I think, and you would also know, you've been in this space for many years. I think slightly more than me. So I think it's not lately, though I've not been reading any books, etc. I must have read in 2005, 2006, 2007. But I think it becomes very, very fundamental. You're kind of measuring everything. You're seeing, and we all know that standard 4-page checkout funnel, then which became 1 click and so on and so forth. And all these experiments we've all done, changing the language, changing from buy to add to cart, etc., etc. Does it increase the size of the cart and so on? So I think for the young entrepreneurs who are starting now, it would be very interesting to actually go through. Now, I can't pinpoint any blogs and so on, but I think a lot of wisdom on add to cart, e-commerce is already built. How to optimize the checkout funnel. So 80% of the job can be done if you just go to the right resources and read the right resources. And I think what also happens is, as you actually execute a lot of these things, you understand how A/B tests are done, you understand how multivariate testing is done. Once you've done that, then I think you generally become more scientific, more in your approach in general. Yeah. So it would be very important for anyone who's starting afresh to go through these resources.
Yeah. So Gaurav, my question was less about the resources, although fair point, was really what are your own lessons learned with doing RTB correctly or to do objections to buy correctly, right? Because I often find that people, when they go around doing surveys or user research or customer discovery, I'm a product manager. Mujhe to hi chalana hai. So I just boss, you're not buying because you don't trust us, right? Boom, gone, kapoosh, right? That is, you already led the witness. That's a very tactical example. But since you've done RTB, I don't know if you did an objections to buy as well, but to
So
do it
the
correctly?
second,
Some best
yeah,
practices.
the second cohort that I told you about, which was 25 to 30 times, so the buyers was actually objections to buy. Right? So you're exhibiting the behavior that should actually make you a transacting user, but you're still not transacting. So that cohort is specifically, we found out that cohort. So I think in a lot of cases, what I've seen product managers doing, okay, and I'll only be talking about things that they do incorrectly. That doesn't mean that they do everything incorrectly. They do a lot of
Yeah.
things right, but because the
Yes.
focus is on those things that they can potentially improve on, what I've seen is a lot of times people already have the hypothesis, and when they implement it, they test it in such a way. So okay, they don't define the matrix beforehand while testing it. They set up a test, then look at the metric, which would actually tell them that this was successful. And many of the cases, because it is their own baby, that bias is already set in. So I think one important thing is to define those metrics beforehand, right? So I'll give you one simple example of someone who said that we should increase the size of the search box on our portal. I said, in our category, there are no keywords for people to search. What will they search for? Rings, earrings, and the nomenclature itself is not established. The starting point is not established, right? And the starting point can only be established once people interact with the category enough. So there were those things, but I'm generally someone who say, because it's a very low cost experiment, it takes only 5 minutes. I wouldn't mind you experimenting with it. So go ahead, experiment, right? And it's not that, okay, I was open. I was hoping that it would still work. It might have worked also, actually. I don't know if it worked or it did not work. But there was this, the thoughts were not alike. There was, okay, so he believed something different. I believe something different. That's fine. That is always the case, right? So then he went ahead and increased the size. And then he said that, okay, earlier, people who were searching on our website, only 3% of them were buying. Now 8% of those are buying. I said, how is that even the right metric to look at? Right? It might just be that the people who are otherwise also going to buy are just searching more because we increase the size of the search box.
Got it.
Right? So some of these things, and he was pretty convinced in his mind that earlier 3% people were searching were buying. Now 8% of the people who are searching are buying. So it has definitely led to increase in the business. I said, you just do a simple A/B test, and then tell me if the absolute number of orders in this particular cohort have increased or not. So I think some of those is a very specific example of that bias that sets in once you're actually working on something, and you're not just, and because you're not decided what is the metric that you're going to look at, you actually look at 10 metrics and you ignore those 8 which are not supporting the case, but those 2 which can, even in a distorted way, can support your case. You start believing in those and then move ahead with that. So I think that's and we all swear by A/B testing, right? So A/B testing actually removes all these biases and so on. And even after that, even when you're doing A/B testing, you have to be very clear. Is this thing going to decrease my bounce rate? Is this thing going to increase the page time spent on the site? Is this thing going to increase the add to cart? So is it going to increase the conversion, the people who have already added to cart? So where exactly and what exactly to measure is very, very important. And to define that before running the experiment is very important. Otherwise, the biases will kick in.
Hey, wonderful, Gaurav. I think we could talk for hours, but just to try to bring this to a close, second last question, which I would be remiss in not asking, given that VCs ask this question all the time, this whole notion of CAC to LTV, and how do you figure out, and of course, in your case, you also have to build the brand, you have to build trust. Now you're doing offline 150 stores. So how do you think about the role of marketing and customer acquisition, number one? Number two, is this a category that lends itself to high repeat, or is it more like a 1-2 time, or certainly infrequent category, right? Even if it is multi-time, it might be like I buy a ring now or a bracelet now, but the next thing I might buy might be 2 years later. So can you talk a little bit about this notion of building the brand, marketing, CAC, LTV kind of thing?
Sure. So on CAC LTV, I think this whole CAC LTV kind of came to the picture with online marketing and so on, because everything became so measurable. Before that, marketing was not as measurable as it was. And I think a lot of the early stage internet businesses were kind of arbitrage businesses also. Right. So the idea was that, okay, you're spending this much and getting a person, how much more money you're making from that person. So in fact, if you remember Google ads, there were lots of companies who would actually run Google ads, get people, and then send those people to Amazon and then take money from Amazon, right? So they would actually acquire a person because no one else understood marketing as well as they did. They kind of became they created arbitrage businesses there. So in the single transaction, they would have to measure their CAC and LTV. So they would have to say that, okay, I gave Google 10 rupees for person on an average, and I made 15 rupees from Amazon on average, and 5 rupees what I made. Now, as these businesses mature, what had also happened was these are purely arbitrage businesses, but as businesses mature, as people build more and more compelling offerings, they said, okay, instead of first transaction, there are multiple transactions that a person is doing, right? So I should actually bake in all the value that I'm generating from that person from those transactions, and that's how they started measuring it. So, so I think CAC LTV that way is that's how it was built. Now in today's world, the way it is being used as many of the people are using it as the only metric, which is or the only marketing metric, which I generally don't agree with. Brand etc. also play a very big role. Also, what happens is, and one of the major fallacies that happen is people think that CAC LTV, the ratio of LTV by CAC is very fun. It's a very fundamental uh, number to the business, or in the sense it's like a universal constant for a business. It's not. It changes drastically with scale. If you're spending 1 crore, your CAC LTV is different. If you're spending 10 crore, it would not be a number. It would not be a number. It's not going to be a number even closer to the number that you're seeing. I have seen online marketing performance degrading by almost 60% as you double your budgets, right? So, and now very early on, when I looked, and that's why VCs, I'm not sure should be as focused on it as they are, because VCs are in the business of actually investing in businesses which are going to grow 20x, 30x, 40x. Now, when they grow 20, 30, 40x, that CAC LTV equation is not going to hold anyways. So it's
That's
not
correct.
that you can actually just keep that as constant. In Excel sheet, people do that they keep that constant and they increase the size and then say, okay, CAC LTV or CAC will go down by 30% in 4 years. Market will go up by 10 times in 4 years, etc., etc. None of that actually pans out. It's a function of the budget. At 10 lakh, you have a different LTV CAC, and at 1 crore, you have a different LTV CAC. So I don't think VC should look at it. Fundamentally, entrepreneurs should definitely look at it, because it tells them how much they can stretch their business, how much more can they spend in online marketing without actually going overboard.
Got it.
And the second part of the question was on us. So I believe a lot more in brand spend, etc. I believe marketing's job is to grow the category, to grow awareness, to kind of bring more people on the table. Online marketing, I believe, is like a sales spend. It's like a salesperson in your showroom. Okay, and you should only spend as much on it as you're making in that transaction, or in, let's say, next 1 to 2 years on that person, on that particular customer, which is a duration we define for lifetime. And whatever we get after that is something that a company needs to make bottom line also, right? I have folks coming over from Google that you're making this much on customers on average, so you can spend more. I said, I need to make money also. So I don't look at blended CAC. I actually break it down into the CAC I'm spending on the last person that I'm acquiring, not the blended. Obviously, blended CAC or blended cost of acquisition has to be something which actually generates a lot of money for the business.
Got it. Hey Gaurav, we've gone well over our time, but I'll close with one question. What advice would you, Gaurav, give the Gaurav of 2012 or 2011 when you started Bluestone? What are 1 or 2 things you would redo or do differently, or what are 1 or 2 things you would say, this, I just got this right and I wouldn't change it for a dime?
I think some of the things that so basically offline rollout which started in 2018, I would actually with the kind of conviction that I have now on this whole omni-channel behavior, I would have actually done that much sooner. Some of the mistakes that we did on the way, I think hiring aggressively or going overboard on. So in 2015-16, that was very common across a lot of companies. What we also did was we also stretched our marketing budgets, our team size, etc., believing that the online is going to kind of keep on increasing perpetually, which was not the case. So I would not do few of the things that I'd done on the way. Would have built it a lot more frugally and a lot more. So basically, I would stave off some $20 to $30 million that were kind of spent, which could have easily been saved in 2 to 3 years, which we delayed in rolling out our offline stores to kind of complement the online offering. Would have done that sooner.
Hey, fantastic, Gaurav. I'm sure a lot of entrepreneurs will benefit from this. I certainly did. invigorated my thing about the reason to buy. I often obsess on customer discovery before you start up or 0 to 1. So I learned quite a few things myself. Thank you so much for being on the Prime Venture Partners podcast.
Thank you, Amit, for hosting me.
Dear listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast app for free, and you'll be the first one to know when new episodes are available. Just search for Prime Venture Partners podcast in Apple Podcast, Spotify, Castbox, or however you get your podcasts. Then hit subscribe. And if you have enjoyed the show, we would be really grateful if you leave us a review on Apple Podcast. To read the full transcript, find the link in the show notes.